Hello students, I am Dr. Yogesh from the English department, Khalsa College. Today we will be looking at paper 4, Restoration in Augustan Age, semester 6. How to write answers? Let us look at that first. There are two types of questions asked. One are the short notes, others are long answers. When you write short notes, you need to explain the concept thoroughly, write its characteristics, mention the major practitioners and their major works. When you write long answers, however, especially when we have a play here, you have to know the plot, themes and characterization very clearly. Also read the play a number of times. When you answer the question, also include critic quotes and textual quotes. These are what is going to fetch you the marks. Now I have made several PPTs for the major questions that might be asked and also discuss some questions intermittently. Let us proceed with the PPTs, but before that, I would like to express my gratitude to BNN College and its dignitaries. Shri Vijay Jadhav Sir, Honorable President, Shri Balakrishna Kale, Honorable Executive President, Dr. Ashok Wagh Sir, Principal BNN College, and my own friend Dr. Sudhir Nikam, HOD and Chairperson, BOS, University of Mumbai. And last but not the least, I would like to express my gratitude to Namrata Jadhav Madam, who had taken a lot of pains to make this possible. I cannot forget my own son, who used in this Karan Anvekar from IIT Dharwad. Now let us proceed. Hello students, today let us look at restoration drama, both comedy of manners as well as heroic tragedy. The revival of drama in England after the restoration of the monarchy is known as restoration drama. Its main features were the reopening of the theatres of the Puritan interregnum, the formation of new acting companies, and the first appearance of women on the English stage. Dominant genres of the era were the comedy of manners and the heroic drama, both of which show strong French influence. This was encouraged by the king himself, who had become familiar with the works of Corneille and others while in exile in France. In the 2 decades without drama, many actors, playwrights, and regular theatre goers had died. The early restoration audience was made largely of courtiers and of aristocrats, although the influence of the middle classes became greater as the era went on. Charles himself took a tight control on the new theatres, issuing patents to only Thomas Killigrew of the King's Men, who played at Drury Lane, and William Davenant of the Duke's Men at Lincoln's Inn Fields. The new audience was small and it barely supported 2 theatres. The 2 companies merged in 1682. Because of their novelty value, the most famous performers tended to be women. The greatest achievement of the Restoration Theatre was in comedy. The English comedy of manners was pioneered by Sir George Etheridge, who took his cue from the works of Molière and other French and Spanish masters. The form was perfected by Congreve. Other writers who produced witty comedies with intrigue and sentiment include Aphra Behn and John Vanbrugh. The works of William Wycherley are darker and more satirical. George Farquhar, who enjoyed success with the Beaux Stratagem in 1707, is usually considered the last true exponent of Restoration comedy. In tragedy, the attempt to imitate French neoclassical models spawned a number of high-flown works in rhyming verse, notably Dryden's Cynic Love and Almanzor. The only Restoration tragedies to enjoy regular revivals today are Dryden's All for Love and Thomas Otway's Venice Preserved, both of which are in blank verse. The heroic tragedy deals with the conflict between love and honor or love and duty. Such conflict is a characteristic phenomenon of the 1660s and 1670s. The heroic play demands heroic characters without fatal flaws. They are daring and passionate lovers. When they are trapped in the irreconcilable conflict between their passion as lovers and their honor as friends and rulers, they give vent to their emotions and agonies in high declamatory speeches or highly stylized meditations on life and death before meeting their own end. The world of high passion, of high-flown declamation of valiant heroes and beautiful heroines, torn between conflicting emotions, is far removed from actual life. But in Restoration England, this type of drama certainly answered some desire in the audience to see love and honor treated in a grand manner on an unreal platform. The fashion of writing this type of drama was certainly under the influence of French tragedy. John Dryden was a master of mock heroic poetry, and he took a lot of what's say inspiration from French classical drama, especially the works of Corneille and Racine. Besides Devenant's play The Siege of Rhodes is said to have much bearing on Dryden's introduction of heroic tragedy. For Dryden, the heroic play is a tragedy with a noble theme and noble expression. Heroic tragedy was first popularized by Sir Robert Howard and Dryden himself. Dryden, however, was the most successful practitioners of this type of drama. George Cartwright, with his play The Heroic Lovers, published in 1661, pioneered the species. Roger Boyle, the Earl of Orrery, attempted heroic tragedy in his Henry V and the Black Prince. At the same time, Dryden and Howard produced The Indian Queen. The play was successful and was immediately followed by The Indian Emperor. And in 1670 came the most expansive and fanciful of all the heroic plays, The Conquest of Grenada by the Spaniards in 10 acts. This play expressed Dryden's confidence that heroic tragedy was the most erudite and elegant of all forms of drama produced in any age. Heroic tragedy was first popularized by Sir Robert Howard and Dryden himself. Okay. George Cartwright, with his play The Heroic Lovers, published in 1661, pioneered this species. In 1675, Dryden composed Aurangzeb, the most sober and the last of his contribution. The scene is set in India. The play shows the nobleness of Aurangzeb as he struggles against the faithlessness of his father and his brothers, and indeed of all around him. The play shows that Dryden was growing tired of the composition of grandiose heroic tragedies in rhymed words. His all for love can be exemplified first in this regard. It is a play with a tone and feeling very unlike that of a characteristic heroic play, like on the Antony and Cleopatra theme. Dechis calls it a rewriting of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. The whole theme, according to him, is narrowed down and concentrated only on the conflict between love and honor. During this age, the heroic couplet was recognized the only medium of poetic expression. It was no longer possible to write one's thought in prose. The fastidiousness of the public ear did not appreciate the mob of gentlemen who wrote with ease. In the heroic couplet, the poets put all their skill and wrote with unimaginable correctness and precision. In the history of England, the Restoration period was not at all a heroic one. Hence, the concept of heroism was so artificially inflated. Most of the heroic tragedies are bizarre to a modern reader. The ideal of life presented in heroic plays also seems to be strange and excessive. Moreover, the spirit of such plays is far away from actual life. The drama, especially the comedy of manners, proved to be one of the most important genres in the Restoration era. It started developing after reopening of the theatres immediately in 1660. The Restoration comedy is called comedy of manners as it is presented, and as it presented the superficial habits and manners of only a section of the society, elegant aristocracy, with their vices, intrigues, and outward glamour of the polished behavior. The manners displayed were the affections and the cultured veneer of the society. Amorous intrigue played a very crucial part in the action of the drama. As an artistic piece of literature, the Restoration comedy of manners mirrored the dilettante society of the day. The playwrights who practiced the comedy of manners in the Restoration age were mainly William Congreve, George Etheridge, William Wycherley, Thomas Chadwell, Sir Vanbrugh, and George Farquhar. George Etheridge's comedies blaze the track upon which Congreve ventured. His major comedies are The Comical Revenge or Love in a Tub, She Would If She Could, The Man of Mode or Sir Poppling Flutter. The brilliance and the grace of Etheridge's dialogues conceal the weakness of his plot construction. These same features mark the comedies of William Wycherley. Within 5 years, he produced 5 plays: Love in a Wood, The Gentleman Dancing Master, The Country Wife, The Plain Dealer, of which the last two are termed as manly and a gross exposure of human weakness. Studying the social pressures on love and marriage with wit and subtlety, Congreve shows himself the master of Restoration comedy. His comedies are his plays include The Old Bachelor, The Double Dealer, Love for Love, The Way and the Way of the World. Congreve's brilliance lies principally in depicting the cross current of marital complications. Vanbrugh was an architect, but as a dramatist he was extremely popular. His famous plays are The Relapse, The Provoked Wife, and The Confederacy. Farquhar's plays include Love and a Bottle, The Constant Couple, and The Bow Stratagem. In spite of this criticism and condemnation, it has to be admitted that the dramatists of the Restoration period reflected the manners and modes of the society courageously. Without doubt, Comedy of Manners was revived by Sheridan and Goldsmith in their plays The Rival, The School for Scandal, and She Stoops to Conquer. Women participated in the late 17th 18th century theatre in London as playwrights and stage managers as well. During the 1670s and 1680s, Aphra Behn entertained audiences in the capital with a string of witty comedies of manners, thus becoming the first English-speaking woman to earn her livelihood by writing. The Restoration style of comedy fell out of favor in the early 18th century when middle-class audiences began to reject cynicism and licentiousness. The Restoration age saw the beginnings of journalism. The periodical essay was a new literary form that emerged during the early part of the 18th century. Periodical essays typically appeared in the affordable publication that came out regularly, usually 2 or 3 times a week, and were only 1 or 2 pages in length. Unlike other publications of the time that consist of a medley of information and news, essay periodicals were comprised of a single essay on a specific topic or theme, usually having to do with the conduct or manners. They were often narrated by a persona or group of personas, commonly referred to as a club, the Coverley papers or the Mr. Coverley being the most important. For the most part, readers of the periodical essay were the educated middle class individuals who had learning in high esteem, but were not scholars or intellectuals. Women were a growing part of the audience, and periodical editors often tried to appeal to them in their publications. Richard Steele and Joseph Edison laid the foundation of periodical essay during the 18th century. You can also dedicate the rise of periodical essay to the emergence of coffee houses in the streets of London. The periodical essay suited the genius of the people of that age. As I said, the rise of the middle class also saw an unprecedented rise in trade and commerce. There was a requirement to fine-tune the morals and manners of the age and give them the lesson of refinement and elegance. The periodical essays use a simple language, a conversational style and it was appreciated by everyone, both the educated and the semi-educated. Though the practitioners of periodical essay were Pope, Swift, Dr. Johnson, Goldsmith, but the success was found only by Joseph Edison and Richard Steele. Joseph Edison, English essayist, poet, and dramatist, with Richard Steele, was a leading contributor and guiding spirit of the periodicals, The Tatler and The Spectator. Along with Steele, Edison would contribute the majority of the content for 3 of the most influential periodicals of the 18th century, Tatler, Spectator, and Freeholder, all of which set standards for literary taste and criticism which would endure throughout the remainder of the century. Edison was also an accomplished poet and playwright, and his tragedy Cato became one of the most popular plays of the 18th century English stage. Edison is best remembered today as having perfected the form of the periodical essay. His essays produced in Tatler and Spectator and in a handful of independently published books are considered timeless masterworks of English prosody. As an author of periodical pieces that are now nearly 300 years old, Edison has understandably become less popular than he once was. Nevertheless, he is still one of the masterful and intelligent essays in the English language and a seminal figure in the history of 18th century literature. As the quote says, the Spectator will aim to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. The journal reached an audience of thousands of people every day because the Spectator was something that every middle class household with aspirations to looking like its members took literature seriously. The Spectator used simple language, and its morality of morality and advice and entertainment were considered exemplary. It, as the quote says, it brought philosophy out of the closets and libraries of schools and colleges to dwell in clubs and assemblies at tea tables and coffee houses, which were immensely popular in London society. The Spectator was approximately around 2,500 words long, as I said, around 2 or 3 pages, and ran for 555 numbers beginning from on March 1711. They have been collected into 7 volumes. The paper was revived without the involvement of Steele in 1714 and appeared thrice weekly for 6 months. Richard Steele assumed the pseudonym of Isaac Bickerstaff, and he was an English essayist, dramatist, journalist, and politician, best known as principal author of the periodicals The Tatler and The Spectator. Steele started a Tatler in 1709 and stated his purpose in these words: The general purpose of this paper is to expose the false art of life, to puff off the disguises of cunning, variety, and affectation, and to recommend a general simplicity in our discourse and our behavior. Under his pseudonym, Steele recommended truth, innocence, and honor and virtue as the chief components of life. The Tatler kept away from politics. Its publication was stopped and its place was taken by the Spectator, to which Edison and Steele were the chief contributors. As a writer, Steele is remarkable for his versatility in conceiving humorous types of characters for the wide range of his sympathies, for the readiness with which he adapts himself to his subject matter, whether grave or comic in character. Steele paved the way for future development of periodic literature. The aim of Steele's essays was didactic. He desired to bring about a reform of the contemporary society and its manners. He is notable for his consistent advocacy of womanly virtue and the ideal of gentlemanly courtesy, chivalry, and good taste. The Steele-Edison literary partnership ranks as one of the most successful in the history of English literature. Both men were Whigs and sympathized with the moral attitude of England's rapidly growing middle class. They differed greatly in temperament, Steele being impulsive and warm-hearted, and Edison restrained and sedate. The Spectator had a run of 555 daily numbers. Steele authored about 240 issues. The main reason for the success of political literature in the 18th century lay in the fact that it suited the moral temper of the age. In the words of W. H. Hudson, they set themselves as moralists to break down two opposed influences, that of the profligate restoration tradition of loose living and loose thinking on one hand, and that of Puritan fanaticism and bigotry on the other. Their method was admirably adapted to their purpose. They did not indulge in sweeping condemnations and unqualified invectives. They wrote good-humoredly, met all classes of people on their own ground, and made allowance for the ordinary feelings of humanity. But at the same time, they advocated claims of decency and good sense. I would once again acknowledge Shri Vijay Jadhav Sir, Honorable President Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, Shri Balkrishna Kale Sir, Honorable Executive President Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, Dr. Ashok Wagh Sir, Principal BNN College, and my own friend Dr. Sudhir Nikam Sir, HOD and Chairperson BOS in English, University of Mumbai. Hello students, right? Let us look at the rise of the novel now. The novel as a literary genre emerged in the beginning of the 18th century. People wanted to hear stories of those who are not too different from themselves in a community recognizably akin to their own. There are other reasons and factors that influence the rise of the novel. The invention of a traveling library was one of those, and via trade it was developed more than before. The social milieu and the social condition of the life of the middle class was very much affected by the rise of the English novel. These people in the 18th century were acquiring their education. What they were acquiring was less exclusively classical in context than the education of the upper class. Women readers are considered a crucial factor in providing readership. A better education for women was coincided with a period for greater leisure for women in the middle and upper ranks. The greater leisure for women left a time space which needed to be filled in. Men were also educated and had the intention to see beyond the narrow local interests in profession to an aspired motivation. Both men and women were receptive to literary forms which would open to them distant and real worlds outside their own world. The reproduction of newspapers in the 18th century is evidence, which is evidence of the fact. The seed of Richardson's Pamela was a plan to write a series of letters which provided examples of the correct way of continuing in various delicate social situations. Novelists also believed that their task was not only to inform but also to indicate morality. Middle class people considered usefulness significant, but this would include moral usefulness also. Readers were introduced by the novelist to new social worlds, providing the moral framework within which that behavior was supposed to be enacted. The novel was dealing with immediate details as no earlier fiction had been. As a result, it became a long narrative. The rise of the novel is the novels are basically of two types. One is picaresque and the other is epistolary. Picaresque are lengthy, loosely linked episodes dealing with the life of a rogue or you can say a man with negative traits, with his intrigue, fights, and amorous adventures. Epistolary novels are novels written as a series of letters by one or more characters, and allows authors to present feelings with multiple narratives. The major novelists of the period include Daniel Defoe, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, Tobias Smollett, and Lawrence Stern. Daniel Defoe was an English novelist, pamphleteer, and journalist. He is best known for his novels Robinson Crusoe, a fiction novel based on several short essays he had composed over the years, and also was based on a true incident concerning a sailor uh, who was left isolated on an island. The other novels include Moll Flanders, Colonel Jack, Captain Singleton, Journal of the Plague Year, and Roxana. He- His novels mostly deal with criminals and people who are reformed at the end with a happy ending. Samuel Richardson is remembered today as one of the most important innovators of the novel. Pamela follows the travails of a young virtuous maidservant as she seeks to fend off and then reform her rakish employer, Mr. B. Astonishingly, for the time, Richardson's epistolary novel highlighted the inner life and moral principles of protagonists from a modest background. In his monumental second novel, Clarissa, which was published in several volumes from 1747 to 1748, Richardson honed his stylistic focus on the complex inner life of his characters, especially the virtuous Clarissa Harlowe and the unreformed libertine Robert Lovelace. The drawn-out serialization of Clarissa allowed Richardson's readers to imagine themselves as engaged in the writing process, penning fan letters to him that begged the author to write a happy ending for the tormented protagonist. In response to demands that Richardson envisioned a male character as virtuous as Clarissa Pamela, Richardson wrote the history of Sir Charles Grandison, in which male moral virtue was lauded. Richardson's final works are like his first ones, didactic volumes of moral instruction, but with a twist. Henry Fielding, novelist and playwright, who, along with Samuel Richardson, is considered a founder of the English novel. Among his major novels are Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones. Fielding's turn to fiction came by way of his satirical impulse. The popularity of Samuel Richardson's Pamela inspired him to write an imitative parody, an apology for the life of Mrs. Shamela Andrews, which Fielding published anonymously. Mocked Richardson's style of writing at the moment, in which his heroines dashed off letters while defending their virtue. Fielding continued riffing on Richardson's famous novel in his second book, Joseph Andrews, which chronicled the adventures of Pamela's brother in a genre-crossing performance that Fielding dubbed a comic epic poem in prose. Tom Jones, Fielding's masterful picaresque, remains an important milestone in the development of the 18th century novel, with its complex plot and its mixture of moral seriousness and comic adventure. Tobias Smollett was a Scottish author, poet, and novelist, best known for his picaresque novels such as Roderick Random and Peregrine Pickle. They generally followed a comic misadventure of a well-meaning but unscrupulous vagabonds throughout the underbelly of English social life. Smollett wrote during the golden age of the English novel, a time during the English when the 18th century was undisputably producing more fiction than anywhere else. His other novels include Ferdinand Count Fathom and Sir Launcelot Dewes. Lawrence Stern was an Anglo-Irish novelist and an Anglican clergyman. He wrote the novels The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy and A Sentimental Journey to France and Italy, and also published many sermons, wrote memoirs, and was involved in local politics. Tristram Shandy looks forward to the post-modernist novel with its non-linear narrative and a lot of experimentation. Novel which began in the 18th century till today remains a pertinent and relevant as a literary genre. It is in fact the main genre of literary expression today. A new trend of writing, known as diary writing today, became a norm of the Restoration age. The diary writers have played an important role not only in literary development but also in the recording of historical events. For the recreation of a past age, the diaries are perhaps the richest source of detail. They provide detailed accounts not only of major historical events but also personalities. They provide information about their social background, manners, and morals, contemporary taste and fashion in recreation, food, and dress. Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn were the most important diary writers. Samuel Pepys was the most famous diarist of the period. Seems to have begun his diary because he was aware of the crisis affecting the nation at the start of 1660. Pepys was diligent, able, and patriotic. This master diarist started his diary in 1660. He wrote his diary for 9 years. His interests are varied, and perhaps this quality made him a keen observer of his surroundings. His diary presents him as a man who was inquisitive, childish, and clear headed, vain, ambitious, as well as quarrelsome. He was at one and the same time a hard and diligent worker, one capable of total abandon on enjoyment at the moment. He had a zest for living, and there were a few things that did not interest him. He had an eye for the strange and novel occurrences in life. In his works, he seems to be looking upon life with the inquisitiveness and enthusiasm of a child. His personality was versatile and he had an open and straightforward outlook. His diary provides a panoramic view of the age. He had a great attraction for the theatre and is said to have played Tron from work and emptied his pockets into enjoy it. Theatre goer was an exacting, if not always discriminating critic. He makes stark comments about plays and their performances. About A Midsummer Night's Dream, he has commented, the most insipid, ridiculous play I ever saw in my life. The details regarding dress in his diaries. The diary is an honest record of all Pepys' virtues and vices, his quarrels with his wife, attraction he felt for women, and the general happy disposition of his mind. He is critical of excesses in public. He describes in detail the life in the court and about the scandals and rumors of his time. Pepys' eyewitness descriptions are very absorbing. We find a graphic description of the plague in his diary. It began in the month of June in 1665. Pepys noticed houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us written upon them. The people die, so that now it seems they are fain carry the dead to be buried by daylight, the nights not sufficing to do it in. And my Lord Mayor commands people to be within at night, as all, like as they saw. This reminds us of today's situation with COVID-19. Also, restricting us to our own houses, but it is very important that we stay indoors and survive. A year later, Pepys survived unscathed the second great catastrophe of the 1660. A great fire broke out at Whitehall, and Pepys was the first to carry the news to the king. He describes in great detail the signs of destruction and distress. People running hither and thither, trying to save their possessions. Some piled them into churches and friends' houses still intact. Some transported goods on the boats at the river. And this and much more is narrated by Pepys with all the urgent actuality of a modern running commentary. A sense of the impulse of a diary writer on writing his diary is self-expression. He writes for his own satisfaction also, and he records all the experiences. One very important diary writer of Pepys' period is John Evelyn. It is important to note that John Evelyn was one of the founder members of the group of men interested in science and the improvement of natural knowledge by experiment, which became the famous Royal Society of London. Evelyn was a cultivated gentleman of wide curiosity who travelled in France and Italy as well as in England and later held a variety of public positions. Travel, architecture, arts of life, and inventions that made his life easier or more interesting remained Evelyn's chief interest. His self-possession, urbanity, quiet loyalty, and self-discipline remind us of the Restoration balance. His diary opens in 1641 when he was 21 years of age with a retrospective summary of his parentage, birthplace, and boyhood. He continued to write his diary till his death. His diary contains a record of events which took place till nearly a month before his death. He lived a long and busy life of nearly 65 years. He borrowed generously from newspapers of the day in order to supplement his personal observations. His diary provides an first account of the first blood transfusion and various experiments and discoveries made in this period. In his diary, Evelyn wrote an account of the great fire of his time. His records are full and to the point. He also given an apt and complete description of life in the Whitehall just before the death of Charles II. His account of the great fire, which broke out in London in September of the year 1666, remains the best known contemporary description which has come down to us. All the sky were of a fiery aspect, like the top of a burning oven, and the lights seen above 40 miles round for about many nights. God grant my eyes may never behold alike, who now saw about 10,000 houses all in flames, the house and cracking thunder of the impetuous flames, shrieking of women and children, the hurry of the people, the fall of towers, houses and churches was like an hideous storm. Restoration England is brought to life in the pages of his diaries in a particularly engaging manner. Using the diaries as a source and reference, we can spend fortnights in the company of Pepys and Evelyn, exploring their lives, beliefs, careers, and the society they lived. These pages are a major source of us understanding the social life of the restoration. Hello students, today let us have a look at the play She Stoops to Conquer by Oliver Goldsmith. Oliver Goldsmith was an Irish novelist, playwright, and poet who is best known for his novel The Vicar of Wakefield, his pastoral poem The Deserted Village, and his plays The Good Natured Man and He Stoops to Conquer. This was first performed in Drury Lane and it is one of his most famous plays. She Stoops to Conquer opens with a prologue in which an actor mourns the death of classical low comedy at the altar of sentimental mawkish comedy. He hopes that Dr. Goldsmith can remedy this problem through the play about to be presented. Act 1 is full of setup for the rest of the play. Mr. and Mrs. Hardcastle live in an old house that resembles an inn, and they are waiting for the arrival of Mr. Marlowe, son of Mr. Hardcastle's old friend and a possible suitor to his daughter Kate. Kate is very close to her father, so much so that she dresses plainly in the evenings to suit his conservative taste and fancifully in the mornings for her friends. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hardcastle's niece Constance is in the old woman's care and has her small inheritance held until she is married, hopefully to Mrs. Hardcastle's spoiled son from an earlier marriage, Tony Lumpkin. The problem is that neither Tony nor Constance loves each other, and in fact, Constance is a beloved who will be traveling to the house that night with Marlowe. Tony's problem is also that he is a drunk and a lover of low living, which he shows when the play shifts to a pub nearby. When Marlowe and Hastings, who lose their way, arrive at the pub, Tony plays a practical joke by telling the two men that there is no room at the pub and they can find lodging at the old inn down the road, which is actually Hardcastle's home. Act 2 sees the plot get complicated. When Marlowe and Hastings arrive, they are impertinent and rude with Hardcastle, whom they think is a landlord and not a host. Hardcastle expects Marlowe to be a polite young man and is shocked at his behavior. Constance finds Hastings and reveals to him that Tony must have played the trick. However, they decide to keep the truth from Marlowe because they think revealing it will upset him and ruin the trip. They decide that they will get their jewels and elope together. Marlowe has a bizarre tendency to speak with exaggerated timidity to modest women, while speaking in lively and hearty tones to women of low class. When he has his first meeting with Kate, she is dressed well and hence drives him into debilitating stupor because of his inability to speak to modest women. She is nevertheless attracted to him and decides to try and draw out his true character. Tony and Hastings decide together that Tony will steal the jewels for Hastings and Constance so that they can be rid of his mother's pressure to marry her, whom he doesn't love. Act 3 opens with Hardcastle and Kate each confused with the sights of Marlowe they saw. When Hardcastle is shocked at his impertinence, Kate is disappointed to have seen only modesty. Kate asks her father for the chance to show him that Marlowe is more than both believe. Tony has stolen the jewels, but Constance doesn't know and continues to beg her aunt for them. Tony convinces Mrs. Hardcastle to pretend they were stolen to dissuade Constance, a plea she willingly accepts until she realizes that they have actually been stolen. Meanwhile, Kate is now dressed in her plain dress and mistaken by Marlowe as a barmaid to whom he is attracted. She decides to play the part and they have a lively, fun conversation that ends with him trying to embrace her, a move Mr. Hardcastle observes. Kate asks for the night to prove that he can be both respectful and lively. Act 4 finds the plots almost falling apart. News has spread that Sir Charles Marlowe, Hardcastle's friend and father to young Marlowe, is on his way, which will reveal Hastings' identity as beloved of Constance and also force the question of whether Kate and Marlowe are to marry. Hastings had sent the jewels in a casket to Marlowe for safekeeping, but Marlowe, confused, has given them to Mrs. Hardcastle. He finds Kate, who now pretends to be a poor relation to the Hardcastle, which would make her a proper match as far as class, but not as good marriage as far as wealth. Act 5 finds the truth coming to light and everyone is happy. Sir Charles has arrived and he and Hastings laugh together over the confusion young Marlowe was in. Marlowe arrives to apologize and in the discussion over Kate, claims he barely talked to Kate. Hardcastle accuses him of lying and since Hardcastle saw him embrace Kate, but Marlowe does not know that this was indeed Kate. Kate arrives after Marlowe leaves the room and convinces the older man that she will reveal the full truth if they watch an interview between the two from a hidden vantage behind the screen. Meanwhile, Hastings waits in the garden as per Tony's instructions, and Tony arrives to tell him that he drove his mother and Constance all over in circles, so that they think they are lost far from home, which when in fact they have been left nearby. Mrs. Hardcastle, distraught, arrives and is convinced that she must hide from a highwayman who is approaching. The highwayman proves to be Mr. Hardcastle himself, who scares her in confusion for a while, but ultimately discovers what is happening. Hastings and Constance nearby decide that they will not elope but rather appeal to Mr. Hardcastle for mercy. Back at the house, the interview between Kate and Marlowe reveals his true good character, and after some time, everyone agrees to the match. Hastings and Constance ask permission to marry, and since Tony is actually of age and therefore can, of his own volition, decide not to marry Constance, the permission is granted. All are happy except Mrs. Hardcastle, and the mistakes of a night have been corrected. There are two epilogues generally printed to the play, one of which sketches in metaphor Goldsmith's attempt to bring comedy back to its traditional roots, and the other which suggests Tony Lumpkin has adventures yet to be realized. That was really fast. But now let us have a look at the characters. The first character is Sir Charles Marlowe, the father of young Marlowe and a friend of Hardcastle, a respectable and aristocratic fellow from a town who believes his son is of a very modest character. Marlowe is ostensibly the hero of the play, a respectable fellow who comes to Hardcastle's home to meet Kate, possessed of a strange contradictory character wherein he is mortified to speak to any modest woman but is lively and excitable in conversation with barmaids or other low-class women. Mr. Hardcastle, the patriarch of the Hardcastle family and owner of the estate wherein the play is set, he despises the ways of the town and is dedicated to the simplicity of country life and old-fashioned traditions. Hastings, friend of Marlowe's and a lover of Constance, a decent fellow who is willing to marry Constance even without her money. Tony Lumpkin is the son of Mrs. Hardcastle from an earlier marriage and is known for his freewheeling ways of drinking and tomfoolery. He loves to play practical jokes. He proves to be a good natured and kind despite his superficial disdain for everyone. His mother wants him to marry Constance, but he is set against the idea. Diggory is Hardcastle's head servant, not much of a part. Mrs. Hardcastle matriarch is the matriarch of the Hardcastle family, most notable for her pronounced vanity. She cuddles her son Tony and wants him to marry her niece Constance. Kate, called Mrs. Hardcastle in the play, is the heroine of the play. She is able to balance the refined simplicity of country life with the love of life associated with the town. She presents to be a barmaid in order to judge her suitor Marlowe's true character. Constance, called Miss Neville in the play, niece of Mrs. Hardcastle, an orphan whose only inheritance is a set of jewels in the care of her aunt. Her aunt wishes her to marry Tony, but Constance wants to marry Mr. Hastings. Maid is a minor character. The landlord of the Three Pigeons welcomes Marlowe and Hastings and helps Tony to play his trick on them. Jeremy is Marlowe's drunken servant. His drunken impertinence offends Hardcastle many a times, which leads Hardcastle to order Marlowe to leave. The major themes in this play are class conflict. While the play is not explicitly a tract on class, a theme is central to it. The decisions the characters make and its perspectives on one another are all largely based on what class they are part of. Where Tony openly loves low-class people like the drunks and the Three Pigeons, Marlowe must hide his love of low-class women from his father and society. His dynamic relationship with Kate and the way he treats her define who he thinks she is at the time. From high-class Kate to a poor barmaid to a woman from good family, but with no fortune. Hastings and Marlowe's reaction to Hardcastle is also a great example of the importance of class. They find him impudent and absurd because they believe him to be of low class. But his behavior would be perfectly reasonable and expected from a member of the upper class as he truly is. Money. Money is one of the factors that keeps the play pragmatic, even if it veers close to contrivance and sentiment. While some of the characters like Marlowe and Hardcastle are mostly unconcerned with questions of money, there are several characters whose lives are largely defined by a lack or excess of it. Constance cannot run away with Hastings because she worries about her life without her inheritance. When Marlowe thinks Kate is a poor relation of Hardcastle, he cannot get himself to propose because of her lack of dowry. And Tony seems to live a life of unconcern with wealth, although the implicit truth is that his dalliances are facilitated by having access to wealth. Behavior appearance. One of the elements Goldsmith most skewers in his play is the play's satirical moments. Its aristocratic emphasis on behavior as a gauge of character. Even though we today believe that one's behavior in terms of low versus high class behavior does not necessarily indicate who someone is, many characters in this plays are often blinded to a character's behavior because of an assumption. For instance, Marlowe and Hastings treat Hardcastle cruelly because they think him the landlord of an inn and are confused by his behavior, which seems forward. The same behavior would have been appropriate high class if they hadn't been fooled by Tony. Throughout the play, characters assume that they understand someone's behavior, but when what truly guides them is their assumption of the other character's class. Moderation. Throughout the play, the conflict between the refined attitudes of town and the simple behavior of the country are most are mostly seen. The importance of this theme is underscored by the fact that it is the crux of the opening agreement between Hardcastle and his wife, where country characters like Hardcastle see town manners as pretentious, town characters like Marlowe see country manners as bumpkinish. The best course of action is proposed through Kate, who is praised by Marlowe as having a refined simplicity. Having lived in town, she is able to appreciate the values of both sides of life, but can find a happiness in appreciating the contradictions that exist between them. Contradiction. Most characters in the play want others to be simple to understand. This in many ways mirrors the expectations of an audience that Goldsmith wishes to mock. Where his characters initially presented as comic types, he spends throughout the play complicating them all by showing their contradictions. Most clear are the contradictions within Marlowe, who is both refined and base. The final happy ending comes when the two old men, Mr. Hardcastle and Sir Charles, decide to accept the contradictions in their children. In a sense, this theme helps to understand Goldsmith's purpose in the play, reminding us that all people are worthy of being mocked because of their silly, base natures, and no one is above reproach. Deceit and trickery. Much of this play's comic scenes come from the trickery played by various characters. The most important deceits come from Tony, because including his lie about Hardcastle's home and his scheme of driving his mother and Constance around in circles. However, deceit also touches to the center of the play's most major themes. In a sense, the only reason anyone learns anything about their deep assumptions about class and behavior is because they are duped into seeing characters in different ways. This truth is most clear with Marlowe and his shifting perspective on Kate. It is also true for the Hardcastles and Sir Charles, who are able to see the contradictions in others because of what trickery engenders. Okay, students, now the most important part is the exam. You have to remember that some questions which are asked, mainly the question which may be asked in the exam will linger around these questions. What you need to do is always tie it up with the plot and quotes of the play. Let us look at the first question. Explain the meaning and significance of the title, She Took to Conquer. Even without reading the play, the irony of the title is obvious, since the she in the question is lowering herself in order to prove herself superior. In the context of the play, the title could be argued to refer both to Kate's plan to trap Marlowe and to Goldsmith's purpose of using low comedy to convince his audience to embrace it. The former is a good description of the irony of Kate's plan. In order to convince herself she is worthy a match for Marlowe, she has to first convince him that she is of a low class. However, the title also describes Goldsmith's purpose. He wishes to convince the audience to embrace his slow or laughing comedy, and by indulging in it, he might convince them that it is superior to sentimental comedy. Regardless of which description one uses, the irony of the title expresses Goldsmith's view of humanity, which we pretend to be of impeachable high class. We all have a low base side which we should celebrate rather than try to ignore. In what ways is Tony Lumpkin a hero in the play? Use historical social detail to explain why this heroism is unconventional. Tony Lumpkin would traditionally have been considered nothing but comic relief. Consider most of Shakespeare's plays where the poor common characters might have wisdom, but are primarily used to comic effect and are rarely engaged in the main plot. Tony is presented the way initially in She Stoops to Conquer, but we quickly see that there is a great wisdom to his lifestyle, which prizes enjoyment of life over heavy considerations of it. When his parents discuss the way to live in Act 1, Tony takes off quickly for the Three Pigeons, where he sings the song that expresses the desire for true life, rather than the hypocrisy of overly educated and overly religious adolescents. Tony perhaps has more agency than any other character in the play, setting in motion the confusions that ultimately allow everyone to be happy. The message of which Tony is the best representative is that by engaging in the confusions and contradictions of human nature, we can find out our best happiness. Next question. For a comedy, She Strips to Conquer has a serious vein of commentary of class. Explain. In a traditional sentimental comedy, money would ultimately be shown to be irrelevant in the face of true love, so as to stress the character's virtue. Of course, characters would have almost been all hybrid and moneyed, not a serious issue in their life. In this play, there are characters like Tony or Constance who really do need money if they want a strong future. Even in what is perhaps the most cliched romantic subplot, that is between Constance and Hastings, money becomes an inescapable force, and in the end, they turn to the virtue of asking Hardcastle's permission, not because of some innate virtue, but because they acknowledge that they will need money. In another way, Marlowe's class contradictions are certainly meant to be amusing, but there is serious criticism in the way that a class system has led him to despise what he enjoys. He considers himself inferior for his love of unpretentious women and assumes that he ought to love a modest woman. Part of the lesson Kate teaches him is that the substance of a person is what matters and not the way one gauges her behavior as high or low class. In what ways are the characters who play comic archetypes? How does Goldsmith deepen these top characters? At the beginning of the play, it seems that all the characters fall into traditional common comic patterns. Hardcastle is the old curmudgeon who hates modern life. Mrs. Hardcastle is a vain old lady. The young men are all handsome heroes. Kate is a pretty young heroine and Tony is a comic drunkard. Very quickly, Goldsmith explores the depth of class, money, and human contradictions by putting those qualities in broader context. Hardcastle turns out to be not entirely incorrect, but about impertinence of the young, but turns out to be forgiving. Mrs. Hardcastle is frankly never deepened, but stays who she is throughout. Hastings remains a valiant young man, but Marlowe is obviously full of absurd contradictions, very much connected to the very aristocratic virtue that seems to define him in the beginning. And Kate, of course, is perhaps the deepest and fullest character of all, not a simple heroine to be won by the young man. Last question. How does the device of dramatic irony facilitate the play's major themes and comedy? The play is a masterpiece of dramatic irony, which is a device from where the audience has information knowledge, what the characters do not. From the moment Tony plays a practical joke on Marlowe and Hastings, the audience learns secrets that grow more complicated and hence create confusion that leads to hilarious situations. The best example is perhaps the way Marlowe and Hastings treat Hardcastle, because they think him a landlord. Because we understand the details of the confusions, we understand the jokes, whereas the characters only grow more offended. However, the behavior wrought by the dramatic irony reveals much of Goldsmith's view of humanity and class. The same example listed above is funny, but also shows the cruelty that comes from a rich man's entitlement. Throughout the play, much of the class commentary derives from the behavior people show when they don't realize they are being judged. Kate exploits this to try and find out what kind of person Marlowe actually is. I am extremely grateful to Shri Vijay Jadhav sir, Honorable President Padma Shri Anna Sahib Jadhav Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, and also Shri Balkrishna Kale sir, Honorable Executive President Padma Shri Anna Jadhav Bharatiya Samaj Unnati Mandal, Dr. Ashok Wagh sir, Principal BNN College, and Dr. Sudhir Nikham, my own friend, HOD and Chairperson BOS in English, University of Mumbai. And thank you students for a patient listening. You can always contact me at the following at the cell number 9833265742 or mail me at karanyanvekar@gmail.com.